The first sign wasn't the sound of engines, it was the way the night stopped being empty. In the Ardennes, winter had its own physics. Noise didn't travel the way men expected. Snow swallowed footsteps, trees absorbed voices, and the cold pressed down so hard on the valleys that even distant artillery felt muted, like thunder trapped under a heavy blanket. But movement still had a signature. It carried through the ground. It turned the air subtly restless. It made animals go still. It made a man's instincts lean forward before his ears could explain why. Private First Class Thomas Rourke lay in a shallow scrape behind a tangle of fallen fir branches, less than 20 yards off a narrow forest road. His body was wrapped in a white overcoat that wasn't issued to him, but had been traded, argued, and finally acquired by a supply pile by sheer persistence. Snow had settled on the fabric and made him part of the ground. He had been in that position for nearly 2 hours, and the stillness had become its own pain. Cold seeped through everything eventually, through wool, through canvas, through the thin arrogance of youth. His toes were numb, his fingers were numb, the bridge of his nose ached as if a thin wire were tightening around it. His rifle lay across his forearms with the careful intimacy of a man holding something precious. It was not precious because it was rare. It was precious because it was the only thing in that forest that could buy time. The road cut through the trees in a gentle S-curve, passing a shallow creek spanned by a small stone culvert. It wasn't a dramatic bridge, not the kind shown in war films. It was a practical piece of Belgian countryside, stones mortared together, a low lip, water running dark beneath thin ice. But the road narrowed at that culvert. The trees closed in. The shoulder fell off into ditch and frozen brush. Anything large had to slow there. Anything tracked had to line up. Anything that got blocked at that point would create a pile-up behind it, a bottleneck, a hinge. Rourke's unit, elements of an American infantry regiment pulled thin in a quiet sector, had been told, like most units in the Ardennes, that the Germans were exhausted, that the winter would be slow, that the line here was stable. The men had heard the same words too many times and had learned to distrust them in the same quiet way they distrusted warm coffee from a dented pot. The day before, a patrol had returned with reports that didn't fit the comfortable story: movement in the forest, distant engines at night, unusual radio chatter, villagers who looked away too quickly when asked questions. Then, near dusk, a runner arrived with a message that made the world shift. German armor and infantry were massing somewhere to the east. Not a raid, not a probe, something bigger, something that had weight. The officer who delivered the message didn't have proof that could satisfy a staff map, but he had the one currency that mattered at the front: the look in his eyes. Orders followed quickly, as they always did when fear finally reached headquarters. A platoon was to move up and secure the road beyond the culvert until engineers could rig explosives or until anti-tank assets arrived. The platoon was late. Roads were clogged. Units were shifting. Radios were already failing in the cold, and the forest swallowed signals like it swallowed sound. Someone had to hold the hinge for a little while. Not to win, not to stop the war, just to delay momentum. Rourke hadn't volunteered in a dramatic way. He hadn't raised his hand and asked for glory. He had simply been the man with the rifle that could reach far enough and hit small enough. And he had been the man who knew how to make it matter. He listened now, cheek against the stock, eyes fixed through a scope that caught faint moonlight and turned it into thin clarity. The scope itself was the first clue that the rifle wasn't standard. The Army had issued sniper's rifles that worked, M1903A4s with Weaver scopes, practical and simple. They weren't magical instruments, but they could kill cleanly at distances ordinary rifles couldn't. Rourke's rifle began as one of those. Then it became something else. He had been a machinist before he was a soldier, not in the romantic sense of building engines in a bright shop, but in the small, precise sense, working metal until it fit the way it was supposed to fit, making imperfect machines behave. When the rifle was assigned to him, he noticed the little problems most men ignored. The way the scope mount shifted under recoil just enough to drift zero, the way moisture from breath could freeze on the lenses, the way the sling swivel squeaked against metal at the worst times. He fixed those problems the way he fixed everything, quietly and obsessively. He cut an improvised sunshade from scrap tubing and slid it over the scope to reduce glare from flares. He wrapped the mount screws with thin wire and set them with a dab of varnish to keep them from backing out in the cold. He bedded the action into the stock with a field-expedient mixture that wasn't official and wasn't elegant, but it tightened the rifle's consistency enough to turn good into reliable. He altered the trigger pull slightly, just enough to make it predictable, not enough to make it unsafe. He filed down a tiny burr on the bolt that had been catching when the grease thickened in freezing temperatures. He switched to a lighter oil he'd found in an abandoned workshop and kept it in a flask like contraband. None of this was authorized. None of it would impress a colonel. It was the kind of improvement that lived in the margin between a manual and reality. The rifle did not look different at a glance. It simply behaved differently when it mattered. And in the Ardennes, December 1944, behavior mattered more than appearance. A faint glow appeared around the bend, headlights partially masked, light leaking through slats. The glow moved slowly, then paused, then moved again. Rourke didn't fire. He waited. Through his scope, he saw the first German vehicle roll into the open stretch before the culvert. A staff car or light truck, canvas top, dark paint blending with the trees. Two figures inside, a driver hunched forward, hands high on the wheel, a passenger with a map board on his lap. Behind it, shapes followed, a half-track, then another, then a line of infantry walking with rifles slung and shoulders hunched against cold. This wasn't a patrol. This was movement with purpose, a push. The passenger in the staff car held a cigarette close to his mouth, trying to hide the glow. He leaned toward the driver, gesturing with two fingers, impatient. Even through glass, even at distance, his manner carried. He wasn't just riding, he was directing. Command in the field was often visible before it was understood. Rourke's breathing slowed. He didn't think in speeches or slogans. He thought in mechanics, distance, wind, angle, the way cold air carried bullets slightly differently, the way the road dipped at the culvert and would slow vehicles just enough to make a driver look down. He had already measured the range earlier by pacing it in his mind, roughly 200 yards to the culvert lip from his hide, a little more to the bend. The wind was minimal, held down by the forest. His first shot needed to be the kind of shot that didn't just kill, it needed to create hesitation. He placed the crosshair on the passenger's head, not because he wanted to be theatrical, but because eliminating the man who looked like he knew where they were going would be more disruptive than eliminating the man who only drove. He waited until the car's front wheels touched the culvert stones and the vehicle slowed naturally. Then he pressed the trigger. The rifle's report was sharp but small in the vastness of the forest, a crack swallowed by trees. The recoil nudged his shoulder, familiar, controlled. The passenger's head snapped back, then fell forward, and the cigarette dropped into the passenger footwell, glowing briefly before going dark. The staff car lurched, the driver's hands jerked. The vehicle rolled another few feet, then stopped hard, angled slightly against the culvert's stone lip. Behind it, the half-track braked abruptly. Men shouted. The whole column compressed like a spring. In a conventional firefight, the response would have been immediate and violent. Here, in the dark forest with uncertain contact, the first response was confusion. Confusion bought seconds. Seconds bought minutes. Minutes bought lives. Rourke shifted the rifle slightly and watched the half-track. A man near the front leaned out, trying to see past the stopped staff car. He wore a field cap rather than a helmet. He carried a map case, a second leader. Rourke fired again. The man's body folded sideways, dropping out of sight. The half-track's driver ducked reflexively, and the vehicle veered, its tracks grinding against frozen soil at the road edge. It didn't tip, but it wedged awkwardly, narrowing the road even further. Now the bottleneck was not just natural, it was manufactured. Men began to spill into the ditch and tree line, spreading out, trying to locate the shooter. German voices rose in pitch, tense and sharp, calling for direction, for cover, for someone to make sense of the sudden loss of movement. Rourke didn't stay in place to savor the effect. That was how men died. He had prepared for this. In the hours before, he had moved through the forest and marked 3 alternate firing positions, small, shallow hides behind fallen logs, each with a clear view of the road at different angles. He had scraped away snow, laid down pine boughs to dampen sound, and tested sight lines in the dim light. He rolled back from his first position and crawled 10 yards through snow, then another 10, moving slow enough to avoid creating a trail that would catch a flare's light. The white overcoat blended, but not perfectly. Nothing blended perfectly when men were looking. He reached his second position behind a boulder partly buried in snow, the rock's surface slick with ice. From here, he could see the rear of the column, where more vehicles were compressing, trucks, more infantry, perhaps another half-track. He wasn't going to kill everything. He couldn't.
He didn't need to. He needed to create the perception of multiple shooters, of a larger ambush, of a trap. The Germans began firing into the trees, wild bursts of machine gun fire that cut branches and sprayed bark. The bullets snapped overhead, some striking the boulder near Rourke with a flat, terrifying slap. The forest filled with the smell of cordite and shattered pine. Rourke waited for a moment when a flare might go up. It didn't come yet. The German column was trying to solve the problem without revealing itself to American artillery. That told Rourke something important. They believed they were still behind the American front line, still moving in what they thought was a thinly held sector. They wanted speed and surprise. Speed and surprise did not like uncertainty. Rourke watched a German soldier run from one vehicle to another, carrying what looked like a radio handset, his posture hunched, movements hurried. A field radio operator, trying to raise someone, trying to report, to ask for instructions. Rourke placed the crosshair on the soldier's chest and fired. The man dropped, the handset falling into snow like a black stone. Another soldier ran forward to grab it, then froze when he saw what had happened. He looked around as if he could find the bullet in the air. He dragged the body into the ditch and began shouting, calling for covering fire, calling for someone to spot the shooter. The column's forward motion stopped completely. Rourke's breath fogged the scope lens slightly. He wiped it with a gloved thumb, careful not to smear moisture. His glove was stiff with cold, movement slower now. He felt his fingers beginning to lose finesse. That was the other enemy, always present. Not the Germans, not their guns, but the cold's slow theft of precision. He had trained for distance. He had trained for wind. No one trained properly for the way winter could turn a man's hands into clumsy tools. He forced himself to flex his fingers, to keep blood moving. He didn't think about pain. Pain was predictable. Numbness was dangerous. The Germans attempted to push forward again by moving infantry into the woods on either side of the road. They moved carefully, spreading out, rifles raised, eyes searching. Some of them had the tight, trained movements of veterans. Some moved like men who had been told this sector was quiet and were now being punished for believing it. Rourke's mind worked with cold clarity. If they flanked far enough into the woods, they could get behind his positions. If they rushed the culvert area and cleared the road, the column would start moving again, and once it did, American rear elements, unprepared, scattered, would be hit by armor and infantry at speed. He couldn't allow the movement to resume cleanly. He shifted his focus away from killing and toward shaping behavior. He watched for any man who stood up, who gestured broadly, who tried to organize. He watched for the ones who looked over their shoulders as if expecting an answer from someone behind them. He found one, an NCO or junior officer climbing onto the rear step of a half-track to shout orders down the line. Rourke fired. The man dropped, falling backward into the half-track bed, and the soldiers around him ducked instinctively, suddenly unwilling to present themselves. The effect was immediate and disproportionate. Men began firing again, but their fire had no direction. It was anger and fear flung into trees. A machine gun barked from somewhere near the front, cutting a line through branches. The German soldiers were not panicking in a wild way. They were doing what trained men did when they were uncertain. They flooded the area with suppressive fire.
Suppressive fire in a forest was expensive. It burned ammunition and revealed positions. It also slowed movement. Every burst was time not spent advancing. Rourke crawled again, switching positions. His elbows pushed into snow and slush. The wetness soaked through his sleeves, then froze. His cheek pressed against cold wood. He tasted metal. He heard distantly something deeper now, an engine with more weight, a heavy rumble behind the vehicles. Armor. That was what the reports had suggested. German tanks or assault guns moving with this push. If armor reached the bottleneck, the Germans might attempt to shove their own vehicles out of the way or crush through. A tank didn't care about a stuck staff car. It could push it aside like a toy. But armor also brought a vulnerability. Tanks depended on road discipline. They depended on clear routes. They depended on officers who made decisions quickly. When those decisions were delayed, tanks became expensive noise. Rourke's scope caught a glimpse of a larger silhouette behind the vehicles, a low, broad shape, likely a Panzer IV or a Stug, hard to tell in the dark, but unmistakably armored. It had paused, blocked by the jam, its commander likely trying to understand why the road was frozen. Rourke could not kill a tank with his rifle. He knew that. He was not delusional. But he could do something else. He could keep the jam intact and make the tank commander cautious. He waited until the tank commander, head and shoulders visible above the hatch, leaned out to look down the road, frustrated by the stuck vehicles. The shot was longer now, the angle worse. The cold made his hands heavy. The scope picture wavered slightly. He pressed the trigger anyway. The commander's body snapped back and disappeared into the hatch. The hatch slammed shut a second later. The tank remained stationary. The column had now accumulated the one thing a breakthrough could not afford: uncertainty. A flare finally went up. It rose with a hiss and bloomed overhead, painting the road and trees in a harsh white light. Shadows went sharp and ugly. The snow became a reflective surface, making every depression visible. In that flare's light, Rourke saw his own breath, saw the line of vehicles, saw bodies in the road, saw soldiers pointing into the woods. He also saw the danger, his position, the boulder, the disturbed snow around it, small signs that could become fatal under bright light. He didn't wait. He rolled away from the boulder and slid down a shallow embankment into a ditch, moving with controlled urgency. His white overcoat brushed against branches and shed snow. The cold air burned his lungs. The flare faded, leaving darkness again. But the Germans had learned something. There was at least one shooter in the woods, and that shooter could hit leaders. That knowledge changed their behavior in a way no number of dead men could. They began moving like men who believed they were under the eyes of a larger force. They stayed low, they hesitated, they waited for signals. They slowed their pace as if any sudden movement might be punished. The delay deepened. Rourke reached his third position, farther back, where a fallen tree formed a natural barricade. From here he could see the front of the jam at the culvert. The staff car still sat angled, blocking. A group of Germans were attempting to push it aside, but the vehicle's wheels spun on icy stone. Men slipped. Shouts rose in frustration. A German engineer or mechanic arrived with a crowbar or tool, trying to pry the car's front end around. He knelt, exposed, focusing on the task. Rourke fired. The man collapsed sideways. The others immediately backed away from the car as if it were cursed. Now the culvert became not just a physical obstacle, but a psychological one. Any man who attempted to clear it became a target. The simplest action, move a car, had become lethal. Rourke understood something in that moment that he would never explain comfortably later. War wasn't only about destruction, it was about control. If you could control what the enemy believed was safe to do, you could control their tempo. If you could control their tempo, you could control the battle's shape. He had turned a culvert into a barrier by making it expensive to approach. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Behind the German jam, engines idled. Diesel fumes hung low and bitter. Men stamped their feet to keep warm. Someone fired a burst into the trees in a direction that meant nothing. Rourke's own sense of time began to distort. Cold did that. Adrenaline did that. The world narrowed to the scope, the trigger, the next movement. He began to feel the price. His fingers, even through gloves, were stiff and clumsy. Reloading became slower. Working the bolt took more force as the oil thickened, despite his careful choice of lubricant. The rifle still functioned, but it demanded effort. Everything demanded effort now. A small sound came from behind him, snow crunching softly. Rourke froze, heart hammering. He did not turn his head, he only shifted his eyes. A figure approached through trees, slow, careful. An American based on posture and gear. A helmet, a rifle. Rourke did not raise his weapon at the figure, but his body stayed tense until the man stopped a few yards away and whispered, "Rourke." The voice was Sergeant Halverson, his spotter. Halverson wasn't truly a spotter the way a sniper team in later wars would have one. He was an infantry sergeant assigned to work with Rourke because the platoon leader believed two men together were less likely to disappear than one man alone. Halverson crouched beside him, breath steaming. His face was pale with cold. "They're moving," Halverson said quietly. "More coming behind. We've got a platoon pulling into position. Engineers, too, but they're not here yet." Rourke didn't answer immediately. He kept watching the road. "How long?" he asked finally. Halverson hesitated. 15 minutes, maybe 20. 20 minutes could be an hour in a breakthrough, or it could be nothing. Rourke nodded once. He did not look at Halverson for long. Eye contact made things feel personal. He needed things to remain mechanical. Halverson shifted his weight. "You're freezing." Rourke's voice was flat. "Everyone's freezing." Halverson glanced at the rifle and then back at the road. "You did this?" Rourke didn't respond with pride. Pride didn't fit. He said only, "They stopped." Halverson swallowed. "They think there's more than one of you." Rourke's mouth twitched once, something that might have been a smile in another world. He had intended that. Now the Germans tried a new approach. Instead of pushing directly, they began sending small groups into the woods on the south side of the road, moving in a loose search line, rifles sweeping, eyes scanning. A classic response to a sniper. They were looking for a single shooter. Rourke knew he could not remain in one position, but moving too far would reduce his influence over the culvert. He needed to balance. Keep pressure on the bottleneck while staying ahead of the search line. He shifted backwards a few yards, changing angle slightly. Halvorsen mirrored him, keeping low, watching for shapes that didn't belong. The German search line was cautious, but it was growing. If they found his trail, disturbed snow, a scrape, a patch of missing powder, they could triangulate him the way hunters triangulated a wounded animal. The next flare went up, then another. The forest flashed bright and died again, bright and died again, like a stuttering camera. Under that intermittent light, Rourke saw something that made his stomach tighten. A German machine gun team was moving up, not to fire blindly, but to set up on the road edge with a clear field into the woods. They were going to rake the tree line systematically. They couldn't see him yet, but if they set up, the area around his positions would become too dangerous to occupy. He needed to break their plan before it fully formed. He aimed at the assistant gunner carrying the ammo box. At that moment, the man was exposed in flare light, stepping over a ditch. Rourke fired. The man dropped, the ammo box flipping open and spilling belts into snow. The machine gunner froze. The team went down hard, hugging the road, suddenly unsure whether to crawl forward or retreat. They dragged the wounded man backward instead of advancing. Again, the behavior changed. The machine gun remained unplaced. The systematic sweep did not happen. The Germans did not gain confidence. Halvorsen exhaled slowly. Jesus. Rourke didn't respond. His cheek was numb against the stock. He could feel the cold in his teeth. The Germans, frustrated, began firing mortars. The first rounds landed wide, thumping into snow and throwing up dark dirt. Then they adjusted. Explosions began creeping closer to the tree line. Mortar fire in a forest was terrifying because it didn't need a direct line of sight. It punished the very concept of hiding. The shrapnel cut branches and turned trees into secondary weapons, splinters flying like knives. Rourke felt a round explode perhaps 30 yards away. The shockwave slapped his body. He tasted pine resin and dirt. Halvorsen grabbed his sleeve and pulled him backward, both men crawling, not running. Noise drew attention. They moved into a shallow depression, then behind a fallen log. The mortar rounds continued, bracketing. Rourke's heartbeat was loud in his ears. He forced himself to slow it. Through a gap in branches, he saw German infantry using the mortar fire as cover to move closer to the culvert, attempting to clear the jam while the woods were under indirect fire. It was a smart tactic. It threatened the one thing Rourke needed, the bottleneck. Rourke's mind worked fast. If the Germans cleared the culvert now, the column could surge forward before the American platoon and engineers were fully set. The momentum would return, and the entire point of his effort would evaporate. He needed to deny them that clearance. He spotted a man in the road, likely an NCO, waving others forward to push the staff car aside. The man's gestures were firm, authoritative. Under the chaos, he was trying to restore movement. Rourke fired. The man collapsed in the road. The others immediately dropped back, as if the road itself were toxic. The staff car remained, stubborn and useless, its dead passenger slumped, the vehicle now a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the German push. The mortar rounds continued, but the Germans did not commit fully to clearing the culvert. They began to believe that any man who stepped into that space would be singled out. Fear did what steel could not. Minutes later, in the darkness behind Rourke, faint movement appeared. American helmets, careful steps, men moving with the disciplined hush of soldiers who knew their lives depended on silence. The reinforcing platoon arrived in pieces rather than as one clean formation. It always happened that way. War never delivered things neatly. An engineer sergeant reached Halvorsen first, crouched low. "We've got charges," the sergeant whispered. "We're setting on the culvert. We need 5 minutes." Halvorsen glanced at Rourke, then back. 5 minutes is forever. The engineer nodded, as if he already knew. We'll take forever if we have to." Rourke didn't speak. He watched the culvert. He watched German soldiers shifting, their push stalled by the jam and the invisible threat in the woods. He realized with a sudden cold clarity that his role was changing. He had been the only thing shaping the enemy's behavior. Now he was one component of a larger trap. The Americans were preparing to destroy the hinge, turning delay into denial. But the Germans, sensing something, began to tighten. More flares went up, more mortar rounds fell. The forest became a chaotic flicker of light and concussions. German infantry pushed closer to the culvert, not boldly, but with rising desperation. A German officer appeared near the staff car, helmeted, moving with purpose. He crouched, looked at the culvert, then began pointing, directing men to move the car, while others provided cover. Rourke's scope found his face in the flare light. The officer's mouth was open, shouting, his hand chopping through air. Command again made itself visible. Rourke fired. The officer went down. The men around him immediately scattered, as if they had been trained not only to obey orders, but to fear the cost of giving them. Halverson whispered, barely audible, "That's 3 officers." Rourke didn't answer. He only breathed. The rifle bolt felt heavy now. When he worked it, his fingers slipped slightly on the cold metal. He forced his grip. The small improvements he'd made to the rifle mattered here. The trigger remained predictable, even as his hands became unreliable. The scope mount stayed true under recoil and cold. The bolt moved without sticking. His unlisted modifications were not glamorous. They were simply the reason the rifle still behaved like a tool rather than a gamble. Then Rourke felt a sharp, wet impact against his left shoulder, like someone had thrown a fist-sized stone at him. He didn't feel pain at first. He felt surprise. A bullet had struck him, glancing off something, perhaps the log, perhaps his gear, and still tearing into him enough to make warmth spread beneath his coat. Halverson grabbed him. "You're hit." Rourke blinked, forcing his mind back into mechanics. He checked his arm. It moved. His hand still worked, though slower. The wound was not catastrophic, but it was a message. The search line was getting closer. The machine guns were probing. The mortars were walking. The Germans were beginning to narrow their uncertainty into direction. Rourke's breathing grew shallow. He fought the urge to retreat too early. Retreat too early and the culvert might be cleared. Stay too long and he might be trapped. His choices were shrinking. Behind him, an engineer crawled forward with a satchel of explosives, moving toward the culvert with a careful, practiced urgency. Another engineer followed with wire and detonator components. They were close enough now that German fire could find them if the Germans pushed hard. Rourke understood the brutal truth. He was no longer delaying for abstract time. He was delaying for specific men on the ground, for 5 minutes, for a charge placement, for a wire to be connected. He had to keep the Germans pinned psychologically at the road. He forced himself into one last firing position, low behind a stump, scope aligned on the culvert lip. A German soldier stepped into the road to grab the staff car's bumper. He moved quickly, as if trying to beat the sniper's attention through speed. He pulled hard, boots slipping on icy stone. Rourke fired. The soldier dropped, and the men behind him recoiled as if struck. It wasn't just death, it was pattern. The pattern told them, the road is watched, the culvert is cursed. The German column had firepower, it had mass, it had momentum waiting to be unleashed, but it did not have certainty. And without certainty, even an offensive hesitated. A shout rose from the German side, angry, commanding. Then the German mortar fire increased, rounds landing closer to the culvert and the American engineers. Rourke fired at the source of the shout and caught a brief glimpse of a man's profile before flare light died. He could not be sure of the hit. He cycled the bolt again, slower now. His fingers were clumsy. The rifle still worked, but his body was beginning to fail. Halverson leaned close. "Charges set. Wires running. We need you to stop them just a little longer." Rourke's jaw tightened. He didn't nod dramatically. He simply kept the scope steady. The Germans finally committed to clearing the culvert with brute force. 2 soldiers rushed the staff car, grabbed its frame, and tried to shove it sideways. A third ran forward with a rope, attempting to loop it around the axle. Rourke fired, hitting one. The others dropped. They tried again. Another shot. Another drop. They stopped trying, not because they couldn't physically move the car, but because they could not psychologically afford the cost of doing it. A flare rose again, bright and harsh. In that flare's light, the culvert looked like a stage, and the staff car looked like a prop in a tragedy. Then the explosion came. It wasn't a cinematic fireball. It was a violent collapse. The culvert's stones burst outward, the road surface buckled and fell, and a cavity opened where the hinge had been. Dirt, rock, and snow shot into the air. The staff car tipped and slid, half falling into the gap like a broken toy. The German soldiers nearest the culvert were thrown down. Shouts turned into panic, not because men were suddenly cowards, but because the plan had just died in front of them. The road was no longer a road. The column could not move through quickly. Any attempt to bridge would take time, and time was the one thing their offensive was trying to steal from the Americans. Rourke watched through his scope as the German tank behind the jam idled, then reversed slightly, as if the machine itself understood that this route had become expensive. The Germans began pulling back from the immediate culvert area, reorganizing, seeking alternate routes, signaling to units farther back. The push would continue somewhere else. It was too large to stop with one destroyed culvert. But here, at this hinge, the tempo had been broken. The forest went into a strange half-silence, not peaceful, but less frantic. German gunfire tapered as men shifted positions. The mortar rounds slowed. The flares became less frequent. Rourke moored his rifle and finally felt the weight of his body. His shoulder burned now, the pain catching up. His fingers trembled faintly as adrenaline drained. His breathing became ragged, and the cold air felt like broken glass in his lungs. Halverson grabbed him under the arms and began pulling him backward, away from the road, away from the killed culvert, toward the American line. Rourke did not protest. Protest required energy. He let himself be dragged through snow and branches, the rifle kept close because instinct insisted it remained important even now. Behind them, engineers and infantry began establishing a more formal defense line, using the destroyed culvert as an obstacle. Men moved with purpose, laying mines, setting machine guns, establishing fields of fire. The delay was becoming structure. Rourke drifted in and out of awareness as they moved. His mind replayed the shots, not with pride, but with the cold recognition of cause and effect. A staff car stopped. A half-track wedged. A radio operator dropped. A commander ducked into a hatch and shut himself away from uncertainty. He had not stopped a division by killing it. He had slowed it by making it doubt its own movement. Later, as dawn arrived in gray strips through the trees, the Ardennes sector would erupt fully. Radios would scream. Units would stumble into battle that they hadn't been told was coming. Maps would become jokes. Roads would become lifelines. The Battle of the Bulge would stop being rumor and become reality. In the chaos of the broader offensive, Rourke's action at a single culvert would be a minor incident, one small delay among many, one broken hinge in a forest of hinges. The official record, if it existed, would be sparse. A line in an engineer report. Culvert destroyed to deny route. Enemy column delayed. A note in an infantry log. Sniper fire disrupted enemy movement. Multiple enemy leaders hit. Perhaps a mention by an officer who heard the story secondhand and repeated it with more certainty than the original warranted. There would not be a medal pinned with ceremony at the culvert. There would not be a clear narrative for headquarters. There would only be the slow understanding, carried by the men who were there, that time had been bought in a place that didn't look like a battlefield. Rourke would spend the next day in a makeshift aid station, a farmhouse with straw on the floor and a stove that barely worked. His shoulder wound was cleaned and bandaged. The medic told him he was lucky. Rourke did not know what that word meant anymore in a war that handed out luck in strange forms. Halverson visited briefly, face streaked with fatigue. "They're saying you stopped the whole push on that road," Halverson said, voice low. Rourke's eyes shifted toward the window, where snow fell in thin lines. "That road," he said, after a long pause, "not the war." Halverson nodded. "That's still something." Rourke didn't answer. He could still feel the rifle stock against his cheek, cold as stone. He could still see the officer's hand chopping the air. He could still hear the muffled crack of his own shots disappearing into trees. He understood, in a way that would follow him long after the war, that the most terrifying power a single man could have wasn't in how many bodies he could create. It was in how much behavior he could change. In the Ardennes, on a narrow forest road, a small bottleneck had been turned into a barrier, not by artillery, not by tanks, not by mass, but by a man with a rifle that behaved exactly the way he needed it to, and the patience to make the enemy believe the woods were full of him. The destroyed culvert would be repaired later, long after the offensive had run out of fuel and certainty. Men would drive over it without knowing what it had once meant. Rourke would not return to that spot. He would not stand at the culvert and measure his own importance. He would move forward with the war and carry the memory like a private injury, something that did not heal cleanly because it wasn't only physical. The line in the forest had held long enough, and in war, long enough was sometimes the only victory that existed.